Good evening, everybody, and welcome back for another episode of Awoken with Aulden. I am your host, Aulden S. Nance, and we have a great episode for you tonight. Bringing on our second guest of the show, a great friend of the show, Chang. Excited to hear what his insights on the economy, and he will have a unique perspective for you to think about as you move day to day and your economic thoughts. Very unique, and one would say America first economic ideology. However, at the end, you'll be able to respond to him through your questions and challenge him on his ideas. Just a quick little recap of what we discussed the last couple episodes. If you saw the motivational message I left for you this morning, go ahead and check that out. Urged everyone to fight for Western civilization and our principles that makes us uniquely American. Going to yesterday's episode, I showcased the Trump administration's excellent idea to pull out of 66, called the Exit 66. Half of the organizations were directly tied with the United Nations, and the other half had severe ties to the United Nations. Many of them were a waste of money, not relevant in today's current age, particularly with the foreign policy matters. So go ahead and check that out if you haven't already. Have a couple topics other than the economy I want to get with you tonight. Want to touch up on Iran once again, major escalation and tensions inside the Islamic Republic, and the response from President Trump and the admin. We will also talk a little bit about our main topic for tonight is the economy and the free market system. All right, we have a comment come through. Let's see. We have at Lily M 1082. The office says hi. Hello, Lily M 1082. How are you doing? At Gianna Gallo -CAO, we love you. Hands up emoji. We love you too, Gianna. Thank you for tuning in to tonight's show. We appreciate your support as we awaken more minds into this mass awakening. Alrighty, so one thing before Iran, want to shout out the Indiana Hoosiers on a relatively easy college football playoff run they have achieved thus far, clobbering the Alabama Crimson Tide, sending them back in a high tide for the offseason. And the Oregon Ducks did some duck hunting on the Rose Bowl, I believe, or the Chick-fil-A Tostitos Bowl. Unsure, there's too many to keep track of nowadays. However, they will face the Miami Hurricanes this upcoming Monday, December the 19th. We are excited and rooting for a Hoosier victory. Congratulations to Coach Signetti on a wonderful season. They are now 15-0. See if they can go 16-0. Okay, with that out of the way, want to get into Iran, what has happened the past couple of days. We got at RDD42. Hey, that's a common, a recurring guest now. Thank you, RDD42, for your comment and support. Okay, so getting into Iran here, we see today the president of the United States get some reassurance that he has heard from somewhere in the regime, the Iranian regime, that the killings have at least ceased for the moment. The numbers on how many protesters have been killed are kind of up in the air. it's tough to tell because Iran, they cut their media last week. I was on the phone with a friend last night. He works at works at a gym, and one of the guests had to step out. One of the people he trains had to step out for a few moments because for the first time in several days, that person lived inside Iran and finally got cell service back and was able to call the person working out. So it's really tough to tell right now. It's a big information war online when it comes to the conflict. And about 35 minutes ago, or maybe a little longer, is that Iranian airspace has been completely shut down. No flights, similar to, and this was Iranian backed and ordered this time, but similar to when the president said no more flights out of Venezuela. And we know what happened a week or so later with Nicolas Maduro being dragged out of bed in his nightgown, was kidnapped by the United States. So the Iranians, they're preparing for something coming. We know what happened last June, the attacks against the nuclear facilities. So this isn't their first rodeo. The regime is fairly unstable with these protests going on. However, they have seemed to been quelled for the time being. Another comment at Ronwin Nance. Good evening. Good evening, Ronwin. Thank you for tuning in tonight and your support. Happy to have you on the stream. Okay, so now why is Iran doing this? That's the question. Who benefits and why? And what does the regime have to do to stay in power? We know by now the Iranian regime, it's not built to thrive, it's built to survive. As long as the regime can continue surviving day by day, they'll be fine. And what are some of the risks with that if they can't? If they can't pay the IRGC anymore, if the Ayatollah can't foot the bill for the IRGC or other top regime actors, if their missile defense capability program, their system, if that gets attacked, that leaves them up to a lot of vulnerabilities and attacks. They won't be able to defend themselves at the moment. And they always have to be ready to respond because if you look at the map, what is east of Iran? The Taliban and Afghanistan. So you kind of see the pressure that the regime is under. So we'll leave it at that for the moment. That's today's Iran update. We'll have to continue seeing if the United States attacks, if there's airstrikes imminent. A ground invasion is unlikely, as you know, they have the terrain, they have the Zagros Mountains to the eastern Iran. So we'll have to continue seeing what happens with the Iranian regime. Okay, so wanted to get that out of the way. That's the Iran update for the evening. And I'm going to do my little monologue about the economy and tee it up for our special guest to hop in here in a little bit. Okay, wonderful. Here, let's, I don't think that's in the way. Okay, great. Free markets. What do we mean by free markets, right? When someone says, what's the, America has free markets, it's a free market capitalist society. What does that actually mean? It means that you and I have a business, you have a business. I can walk into your store, you set the price, I purchase the good, etc. We move on with their day. That's a very basic definition. the prices and supply and demand. This is not elementary school stuff, but stuff you learn maybe in elementary school or middle school or high school, something like that. Just giving everybody a little brief recap or reminder of what the deal is. And what is true economic freedom? When someone says, I need to hit my sports parlay so I can have financial freedom, is that the same thing? Well, kind of. You might be your personal financial situation might be set, but what's economic freedom for the business owner, for the consumer, for your private self, even to invest in the stock market without any hashbacks? You can invest in whichever and whoever you want, whether that's a sport team or AT&T or Apple, etc. And you can do deals with whoever you choose. Now there is the monopoly question, something that we've talked about on the show before, and I'm sure you hear a lot, is home ownership availability for younger people. The prices for homes have skyrocketed, particularly since COVID, but even before that, they were still rising. So is there, like it's BlackRock, is that becoming a monopoly? And we'll talk about the president's Truth Social post a little later when it comes to that topic, I should say, of BlackRock buying family homes, because the admin realizes that they need to kick in a high gear in 26, or the midterms may not be that great. So market concentration replaces competition. You play the board game Monopoly with your mom and siblings as a young child, and eventually it takes like 4 hours to play the game. I don't know if anyone's really ever finished a game of Monopoly. I'll digress to that point, is that by the end of it, there's only one player left and they have everything. And that makes it, for other players to get back in the game, really impossible, essentially. Barriers to entry, they get harder over time for this. As I was just mentioning in the board game, if you're down to Seaside Shores for $200 rent, you're going to get beat out by Perfect Plaza for $5,000 rent in the game. I don't know. So there are some government protections, though. Even though it is free market, the government has shown, or there are means that the government can step in and protect sometimes. And antitrust is supposed to prevent abuse, make sure there's always competition, so where the consumer has good quality ideas to purchase, and protects the consumer so they're not forced into the same product for the same company if it's not healthy for them. So here's the government power and what the markets. Sweeping regulation will steer the industry a good chunk of the time. The below the surface rules really decide where everything is going, exchanging back and forth. Now there are the bailouts, and we'll discuss bailouts here shortly. And cross-border tariffs and rules will guide global trade, which sometimes make it a little tough for if there's global rules that affects just the country, right? So keep that in mind. And Wall Street in New York. I was in New York several months ago and got to check out the New York Stock Exchange, walk Wall Street. Pretty cool. And you see the bull moose there, the golden figurine. And the venture capital will take larger risks, right? We saw with the 2008 crisis, especially if they believe they could get bailed out, they really have no they don't have as much responsibility, and political sway will often shape a lot of the outcomes Wall Street profits from, and it regulates itself. So here's something pretty recently wanted to get into you tonight with. So we heard, a couple months ago, founder of Oracle, Larry Ellison, bought TikTok from the Chinese company, or the Chinese stock, the investors, etc. And he bought TikTok. And the next deal for the media empire is this situation that I present you. So Netflix had a deal to purchase Warner Bros. Discovery, which I believe Warner Bros. They own several, like CNN, and a couple other of these big time companies are under the umbrella that they have. Here I'm trying to, and Endeavor owns WWE talent agencies and sports representation firms. And Skydance Media, David Ellison, the son of Larry, has major Hollywood films, streaming platform content, and deals involving Paramount-linked assets. So it's not just Larry in the empire, it's also David Ellison as well. And as you saw, the deal collapsed a couple weeks ago for the time being. And excuse me one second, I'm trying to get this fixed. But yeah, the deal collapsed, and we're kind of seeing the next steps with that. So that's something that is definitely worthwhile to check out. Perfect. And bailouts. We mentioned bailouts a moment ago. That the 2008 crisis, the global financial crisis, everyone was trying to sell their homes in the United States. It hurt the Republicans significantly for the fall elections. We saw then President Barack Obama win states like Indiana, got close to winning states like Missouri. John McCain ultimately had little chance in that election. This was a catalyst, what is seen for that election. And they're often taxpayer funded. So, and let's go to the 2023 bank runs for a moment. And you have like Silicon Valley, Signature Bank and First Republic Bank all take a collapsement in the sense that the panic spread from Silicon Valley Bank kind of set a little bit of a domino effect for those two smaller companies, or two smaller banks, I should say, rather. And it was taxpayer bought out again. So next time, and something that for younger people, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, you probably went to college. It's probably the most educated generation in a long time, if not ever, in the United States. And there's not enough money for the student loan bailouts, which that would have helped us. But when there's something wrong with the banks or another industry, there's always taxpayer money for that, or there's taxpayer money for foreign conflicts that nobody voted for either. So who really benefits from this mass regulation? Incumbent firms with scale. The compliance costs are fixed and large corporations absorb them, while smaller competitors usually they're squeezed out of the market. The big industries, like if you weren't on Capitol, if you're a friend of mine in DC, you probably weren't on Cap Hill or in the federal government or something like that. You start to recognize the lobbyists that come in frequently in your congressional office or the think tank you work at, or the agency, wherever it is, you start recognizing these faces, and the not consumers or workers by default benefits you typically flow downward when regulation is scoped and even enforced evenly. And so let's get into the president's recent comments about government intervention with these economic indicators. The president announced the 10% cap on credit card interest rates as consumer relief. Because so here's kind of the two big sides with that. You're going to have one side say it's going to, people that are low in credit or bad in credit are just simply not going to be able to get credit cards anymore, or the benefits provided by credit cards. Let's say it's every X amount of dollars you spend, you get like an airline mile. Maybe that airline mile is half of an airline mile or a tenth of an airline mile. So there might be less risk taken by the companies. However, some say, well, it might be protecting these bad investors or these bad people. Not that they're horrible people, but maybe they're not smart with their money, or they're mindless with their money, or careless with their cash or their credit cards, and just spend a bunch of money. So there's both ways to look at it. It really comes down to if you think the government should be involved in this situation. Truly, something we have seen, and it's been a populist on both sides. You have people like Warren and Hawley, for example, teaming up on something like this, or at least agreeing, I should say, rather. And there is some immediate backlash from the banks and Bill Ackman from this move. The next big thing is the BlackRock monopoly risk. The president released a True Social, I believe, last maybe a week and a half ago or something like that now, is to ban large investment firms from buying all these single family homes. And we know what happens when BlackRock buys the house. They're never going to sell it, and they're going to rent it at a higher rate and force people that could normally own a home into becoming a lifelong renter or something like that. And sees it more of a national security issue than an economic issue, with the American dream and jeopardy for young people. He's going to try to ask Congress to pass this legislation, even though we've seen comments from Mike Johnson. No, Mike Johnson made comments about the credit card, but I'm sure similar comments likely about this situation. So this is something else we'll also have to see. We'll see if it's just a True Social post, or we'll see if they introduce something, or get someone like Hawley to introduce it, or even try. I believe the reporting through the Hill indicated that he phoned Elizabeth Warren asking, what can I do about this? And she said, you got to just simply try to use your leverage as president. So especially just think a decade ago, it was the nickname was Pocahontas, and now they're teaming up on trying to stop BlackRock. So crazy world that we live in. So, however, wanting to take a brief pause with the presentation and bring on and introduce to everybody our second guest, Andre Chang. Welcome, sir. Thank you for
hello.
Joining.
Yeah, it's my absolute pleasure.
Absolutely. And Andre, please tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and why you have become Awoken. Hello. Hey, Andre, are you able to hear me still?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. I asked, tell the viewers, a little bit about yourself and why you've become Awoken, and just a little bit about your experiences.
Well, sure. I kind of come from like a pretty standard conservative background. I remember It's kind of going to standard conservative, youth organizations in college, mainly like Young Americans for Freedom. And I think for me, like kind of growing up and just kind of seeing how these policies were being implemented and really begin like think about the rhetoric and the arguments behind them, it quickly came to mind, I think, especially in kind of the ramifications of like the Trump revolution, I would say of 2016, that a lot of these Republican orthodoxies, they're really built off shady assumptions that really just rely on the listener, to just kind of take them as gospel and like never question them. And for me, you know, I guess kind of the aha moment was actually a moment when it was okay. So I believe it was back in 2023, and there was this event. I think a speaker. So the EI event, the theme of the topic was about dynamism, economic dynamism, and the pitch essentially was mobility is super good, right? People should always chase opportunities. Don't be stuck. Always be willing to move. And I just remember the speaker saying something that I still can't forget. He's talking about why people don't relocate for jobs, and he goes, basically, if you stay somewhere to take care of your sick mother, like that's a bad reason to stay. That's he called it an irrational attachment, and like that's a problem. That's friction. And I just remember sitting there. I was like, okay, like this is some psychopathic, economic political jargon. And he's speaking it as like he's some kind of motivational speaker. And I think at the core heart of the free market capitalism debate, the problem with a lot of these like free market fundamentalists or these dogmatists is that really is their moral framework. At a certain point, if something gets in the way of profit or maximization of the economy, whether it be love or duty, then they dismiss these as almost constraints or inefficiencies. And so these things that conservatives say we're supposed to honor, right? So family, rootedness, loyalty to place, these get treated as a kind of defect. And, I'm not saying, markets are bad by nature, but I'm saying that if your economy trains people to abandon duty in the name of rationality, something is off. Like something is clearly deeply off. And, I think the reason why I'm bringing this up tonight is because we're really watching the same kind of argument play out again, just with different headlines. So, as you recently said, Trump has been floating around two ideas that really set off alarms for a lot of people on the right. So, the one, I believe it was the 1-year cap on credit card interest rates at 10%. And the second one is this move to ban large institutional investors from buying up single family homes. And almost immediately, you saw this reflex kick in, right? Like, this violates free market capitalism reflex. Like, the only thing that matters apparently is staying pure to a slogan. And honestly, I think that reflex is part of, the core reason why the right has been just losing ground with normal people, I think for decades. Because it's a habit of mind that treats real problems as inconveniences for theory, which I think, kind of circle back, brings us to the prompt for the show, right? Which is, do free markets really work? And, I think, work depends on what you mean. So a lot of the time, work just means GDP goes up, prices go down, and consumer stuff is cheaper. And look, like these things matter, but conservatives can't stop there. And the question is not just, is the free market free? The question is, free for what? And I want to say this as plain as I can because it clears away, I want to say, a lot of confusion. There is no sacred right to a free market. It's not in the Constitution, it's not in Christianity, and it's not in basic moral reasoning. And we already know that because we don't allow every market, right? We allow some markets precisely because they are predatory. So we don't say, well, if two people consent, it's automatically good. No, we ban prostitution, we ban hard drugs, we ban child labor, we ban the buying and selling of organs. Why? Because we understand that some markets don't just allocate resources, they hunt for weaknesses, they monetize desperation, and they turn the vulnerable into essentially raw material. So, when someone says like, oh, if you're against this outcome, you must hate freedom, like that's not a serious argument. And that's really a way of dodging the moral judgment and the moral situation that we're currently living in. And so I think here's the deeper point, right? Like, I guess kind of the thesis of this, my case here I'm trying to make is that we can't treat capital like it's a literal ism, right? We can't talk about capitalism like it's a creed that sits above the nation, above the family, and above the citizen. So if you force the American statesman to choose, the answer should be simple, right? Americanism first, right? Not any other Americanism, not any other ism, not a theory, not some other label, not some catechism of abstractions. Americanism, right? The duty to the people, the places and inheritance we're supposed to be, handing down intact. And I suppose that's really the thesis I'm advancing tonight. And so I'd like to, with your permission, we can kind of dig deeper into it, into, the conservative case, I think really against the orthodoxies we've held regarding free markets.
Absolutely, Andre. It's a very, very compelling case I think you're going to make, and will definitely some great points for sure. Absolutely. So we'll get back into the slideshow here. From here, I'm gonna take the banner off real quick as well, so there's more room. Okay. All righty. Right. Okay, so yeah, Andre, what is capitalism for?
I mean, again, I think the primary end goal of capitalism, right, isn't just for the sake of its own existence. That's the mindset of cancer, right? The purpose of markets really is, at the end of the day, human flourishing, right? And so if a market isn't actually conducive to human flourishing, like, child labor, right, then we should probably shut down those markets for being predatory. And so we have to, as policymakers and as citizens, we can't just be treating markets as some kind of religion or some kind of cultish, some kind of cult temple. We really we have to choose what markets we want and what markets we don't. And I think ultimately the end goal is human flourishing.
Terrific. Absolutely. Yeah. And you have these 4 tests of success. Can the ordinary work, the generic, the American dream that everyone's been sold for past generations, can hard work and some grit get you the home and a family and all of those, take you to the promised land? So absolutely.
Right. And I think, especially if you were actually to read Adam Smith, what you actually read from Adam Smith's, Wealth of Nations, he actually really departs from like a lot of these assumptions that, like the people like Milton Friedman would make. And I think one of the observations we actually read between the lines is like the invisible hand, a very common term associated with Adam Smith, that explains how capitalism can work. But it's not actually a promise that it will work all the time according, to that kind of maxim. And really, again, one of the key phrases I want to emphasize, markets can be great, right? There can be great servants, but they make awful gods. And I think one of the ways in which you can kind of judge whether or not, our markets are working, again, are really just those 4 key tests. And, if they don't satisfy, right, if they're not actually leading to a higher quality of life, then, pound sand. It's time to change course.
Certainly. Let's head to the next guy here. And one of the big things is kind of just mentioned it. However, you see the disgruntled couple. You see in all those commercials growing up. They're all on Fox News. They're all everywhere. It's the family. They're throwing the paper behind them. The bills are stacking up. The car payment's late. The kid's dental. The kid just lost a tooth. That's a $2,000 bill, right? All of this stuff piles up, and if families cannot be formed due to or it's too expensive, then that's a national security issue.
It seems to me that over the last few decades, the economy has gotten bigger, but I don't think ordinary pay and more concerningly, ordinary family affordability has really kept up. And I think for a lot of people, ordinary work no longer reliably supports ordinary family life. So first, I think the Economic, I want to say Policy Institute, they do the study all the time, and what they found out is productivity and pay has split apart. So we've become more productive as a country, but the gains have, they don't really reliably flow back to the typical worker. And so another problem is you look at basic economic data and upwards mobility has like fallen hard. I believe there was a study that showed like 90% of Americans born in 1940 were making more money than their parents. Um, by the time it reached, Americans born in 1980, it had fell to like 50 or 40 or 50%. So upward mobility has also been declining. And third, the middle class has just been, clearly shrunk in the past several decades. And I think it's because it's economic angst. It's harder to feel stable, harder to get ahead, and harder to it's easier to slide backwards. And I think one of the strongest economic stats that really drives this point home is in 1985, like a typical worker needed about 40 weeks of pay to afford a basic middle class family lifestyle. This is what we call the cost of thriving index. By 2022, it was no longer 40 weeks a year. Essentially, that same worker, in order to support that same kind of lifestyle, would have needed 62 weeks of pay. And I think that's really the whole story in one sentence, right? It's an impossible squeeze of 62 weeks worth of pay into a 52-week year. So, what's the impact, right? Like, why is this not just some, economics trivia? Well, the problem is because when the family wage breaks down, family formation just quickly becomes a gamble, right? So people delay marriage, they delay kids, they postpone caregiving, they move away, from grandparents and cousins or churches, because the only way to keep your head above water is to chase the next job in the next zip code. And I think that really loops right back to my opening story, because now it's not just, some AEI speaker making, this, I think a psychopathic comment. It really becomes the logic of the system, right? So caregiving and rootedness start getting treated like a luxury. And I just don't think that's a winning argument, I think, for a lot of these proponents for free markets.
Certainly, and lots of people our age are going through this problem as we speak. Right, DC is a unique city in the sense that lots of people are mainly career focused out here, and that's fine. But it's not just in DC; it's in all of these cities and around the country as well. So,
right, and another thing is, when it comes to DC, people choose to come to DC. The problem is for large swaths of Americans, realistically, I don't think they really do have that choice. And so it's not really a matter of, you can choose to be dynamic. The problem with at least the current way in which our capitalistic system has been set up is that everyone is kind of forced to play this rat race. And I don't think that's actually conducive to the quality of life of most Americans.
Absolutely. And we will head to the next guy here. And of course, the free trade dogma hollowed out place. The hyper globalization is the policy, and we've seen it through mass immigration, legal and illegal opportunities shrink for native born citizens.
Right. And I think in many ways, this is one of the great tragedies, I would say, of the 21st century, because hyperglobalization, I don't think was as inevitable as some economists like to put it. I really do think it was policy. And I think it really did two things that really weakened the country's ability to make and build. So I think the cleanest way to really see this is, I think, really just China shock evidence, right? So once we start seeing this rising import competition from China, it didn't just reshuffle jobs nationally, because what we were essentially dealing with was we were going to start competing with a country that relies on de facto slave labor. Well, what exactly does competition with slave labor entail? It was like a total race to the bottom. And so it crippled, specific, local labor markets, commuting zones, and it just completely raised unemployment, lowered labor force participation, and just essentially depressed earnings in the places pretty much most exposed. And I think the follow-on work really emphasizes what everyone with common sense already knows, right? Which is these places didn't really bounce back in a clean V shape. I mean, that was essentially the propaganda of free trade, right? It's like, you lose some jobs, but you get some better ones. And a lot of people were willing to say, yeah, we lost those jobs, but no one really paid attention as to whether or not we were actually getting jobs back. And so the problem is like, again, like once you had entire communities hollowed out by this rampant, quick acceleration into deindustrialization, there were entire swaths of America where there were realistic no economic opportunities. And I guess someone can always jump in here and say, sure, but people can move. But and I think this is where conservatives need to have a backbone, right? Which is, just move isn't a policy. It's abandonment. It's telling a whole community, your place doesn't matter. Your roots don't matter. Go be a free agent, in somebody else's economy. And, I think in a lot of places, the story doesn't really end for lower wage. It often ends with funerals. And I think there's serious research linking large trade shocks and deindustrialization to deaths of despair, including fatal overdoses. So when people treat deindustrialization as some like tidy adjustment or market, resetting back to an equilibrium, I just want to say no, right? Like this is and I think this was quite shocking. So the CDC reports that the age-adjusted U.S. overdose rate was 32.6 per 100,000 in 2022. In Russia, shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So textbook example of a collapsed society, like a failed state, right? In 2000, the alcohol-related deaths during that time, right, in the year 2000, was like also in the mid-30s. So we've actually gotten to a point where, like, thanks to deindustrialization, the rate in which there are deaths of despair caused by drug overdoses is actually comparable to the rate of alcohol-related deaths, in the midst of the fall of the Soviet Union. And I think that's really the neighborhood we're in, right? So we really do have a national mortality crisis, and we can't just be dismissing these this real human tragedy is like nostalgia or vibes or people being irrationally attached. I think ultimately this is like real human wreckage.
Make a great point. And you see, like McDowell County in West Virginia, one in Gary, Indiana, even for example, these used to be steel towns, now hollowed out. Gary, the population abandoned the area so quickly they didn't even bother changing signage or properly destructing schools or buildings because it was so quick. And in America, your heritage matters, your ancestors matter, where the local business, whether it was a sandwich shop or a dry cleaner or whatever, that means a lot to your family. It's been in your family for generations, and you shouldn't just have to abandon that for, to your point, become a free agent in another zip code or something like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, in many ways, I think free trade and free markets have really turned everyone into like indentured servants. But at least indentured servants had like a home they could reliably come back to. In many ways, I think free market capitalism has destroyed even that level of assurance.
Certainly. And we have a couple comments from an audience member at GMoney for EVA 2024. United States lowered its trade barriers to encourage economic recovery after World War II and never put them back up, after Europe and Japan recovered until now. Second comment, after they recovered, they began taking advantage of us. So just
the thing is, right, it's like they really weren't able to take advantage of our lower trade barriers, in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And I mean, if you just think about it from some common sense, like we were pretty much the only industrialized country that was not bombed back into the Stone Age. So I think if anything, that's a pretty sweeping, I think, condemnation of free trade, right? Which is the moment these countries were no longer rubble, immediately free trade started backfiring, right? I think really this was a major narrative in the 1980s. Even like Reagan was acknowledging like Japanese automobile manufacturing was like just destroying America. But, I think the problem with a lot of like Republicans is ideology took precedence over, basic observational skills. And you just kind of pretended that, Reagan was a nothing but a free trade dogmatist, and we kind of swept those lessons under the rug. And well, I think until really Trump came in and kind of shook back up the consensus.
Well, certainly. And we'll head to the third ideal, the financialization turn markets into extraction, excuse me. And yeah, capital, it shifted from investment into leverage and payouts.
Well, yeah, I mean, because even with like with deindustrialization and with this hyper globalization, like once a town is hollowed out and jobs leave, like capital doesn't just disappear; it really comes back as rent. And I think the claim is simple, right? The system increasingly rewards extraction. So you have fees, interest rates, payouts, asset churn, more than it actually rewards building and investing. And I think families are the ones paying for it. And I think a good way in which you can kind of like finger in the air realize is more or less true is like most of these people who are graduating like as business majors, right, or getting MBAs. What are they normally going into? They're not going into fields of entrepreneurship, right? They're not going into actually starting new businesses. They're all doing the exact same thing, right? Which is always consultants and finance. And I think that's not a side of an actually healthy and productive economy, right? Um, so let me start with a term, right, that people hear, but don't always have to find. So there in finance, there's a thing called a stock buyback. And what a stock buyback is when a company uses its cash to repurchase its own shares. So it reduces the number of shares outstanding, which in turn kind of like boosts earnings per share and just kind of like almost artificially inflates the stock price without actually building like a new factory, right? Or raising wages or expanding production. And I think here's why people find it horrifying. So in a country where families feel squeezed, right, and towns feel hollowed out, what we're essentially watching is huge sums go into buybacks, which feels like leadership choosing the stock ticker over the nation's capacity to build. And I think it's really an economy announcing, we would rather shrink the share count than grow the future. And you look at the data, you can do this on your own, but it's like every year we're actually reaching new highs of the number of dollars that are going into these like stock buyback programs. And I don't think buybacks are automatically immoral, but I think the pattern matters, right? So, when returning cash to Wall Street becomes like the dominant habit of mind, I think it tells you something about the economy's center of gravity. Are we, building capacity, or are we just kind of managing a stock price? And I think it's quite concerning.
Certainly. Great points there, Andre. Okay, let's head to the next guy. Markets are made, not found. And we've been kind of touching on this a little. And you mentioned this, the invisible hand, earlier.
Right. I mean, so pretty much like neoliberals, I think Hayek makes the argument that markets are essentially products of what he calls spontaneous order. So the idea that there's no, in classical politics, in classical philosophy, there's a term called the nomos thetes, right, the lawgiver. And Hayek essentially argues that markets kind of like naturally arise with really no clear structure from above. Sociologically, I don't think he's even correct, right? This kind of like narrative we see in some economic textbooks that barter came first, and then after barter came money. When you actually look at history, that has never been the case. Money has always pre-existed the idea of transfer of goods and services. At least in this idealized barter system. And I think the history actually shows no, like markets do have lawgivers, right? They have always been structured. And I think that's really what kind of goes back to like I think the heart of this debate or this disagreement between these free marketers versus Trump, right? Because the real fight is not market versus government. The real fight is who writes the rules that shape the market, and what are those rules for, right? Because there's no such thing as a market floating in space. There's always law, right? There's always enforcement, and there's always going to be institutions. So if policymakers pretend that they have like no hand on the wheel, if they say, oh, we're neutral, we're hands off, that doesn't mean nobody is steering. It just means someone else is. And so usually it's the people with the most leverage, right? So with the most lawyers and the least attachment to any particular community. I mean, just like look at workforce attachment. So for decades, like the line was just move or just retrain. But like detachment is real, and people have fallen out of the labor force and they don't really snap back in. And you can't really govern a nation like this on slogans. So again, I feel like this is kind of true for most markets, right? You look at housing, for example, like those markets are structured. And so ultimately, I think the moral North Star, I think that really keeps statecraft from turning into technocracy is, families do not exist to support capitalism. Capitalism exists to support families. And that's really I think the hierarchy of ends when we come to kind of approaching how we should view the structure of the market.
Of course, and we have a question from the audience.
Sure.
At ZSports12. What is statecraft?
Statecraft, I mean, well, it's a lost art, right? It's really it's another term for statesmanship. It's the idea that lawmakers and legislators, they don't exist to simply just keep a seat warm. They're meant to actually push forward political action in the defense of the natural right. And the natural right is really, what is the particular stance or the particular action in the light of, prudence and practical wisdom on how to essentially advance the common good and the national interest. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think it's a lost art.
Great. Hopefully that answered your question at ZSports12. Like based Andre. Okay, we got at William Lewis 2383, based Andre hitting them with the straight facts. All right.
Well, I mean, right. Yeah. Because I mean, if you accept Marx's required governance, like really the question is like who governs and towards what end. And you can try to have everyone's hands off the steering wheel, but that kind of just crashes the car. That's not really like freedom or liberation for anyone. So
absolutely. Okay, let's head. I believe we got another guy here. Yes, and something that I'm sure that you've been kind of hinting at all night is that the right wing, we need a lead on this issue, and that the libertarians and the left are not serious about this.
Well, yeah, I mean, we just covered all these problems. I don't think libertarians actually think there is a problem. So when I first came to Washington, I actually was a very interesting living situation. So I had this roommate who was like a total leftist, right? Like she's like, 7 days in a pro-Hamas, Palestinian encampment on her college campus. And I had this, yeah, well, she was an entertaining person. I'll give her that. And there was this other roommate, which is like this intern for the Cato Institute. And like, the man just genuinely, I remember asking him, it's like, do you think government should prioritize the well-being of their own citizens? And he says no. And I was like, well, I guess there's that, right? There's really no more room for debate. Like, if we're not even willing to agree on these fundamental principles. So, like, I think just patently speaking, like, if libertarians don't think there's a problem, then there's no way they can actually lead the way towards actually building a solution. And, the problem with the left is, when they try, they almost always only resort to essentially bureaucracy, cultural ideology, and also just alliances with concentrated institutional power. And I think the result is what, I think people call woke capital, right? So it's really concentrated corporate power paired with the ideological enforcement from the left. And I think that the bottom line, like why the left can't actually, deliver on this issue is because they're total degenerates. And I'm not even saying that as like a throwaway insult. I mean, like, I mean it as a judgment, like what they normalize, what they celebrate, and what they impose. And a side that treats, the mutilation of children as health, right? The industrial slaughter of the unborn as healthcare. And, that elevates officials who talk, like home ownership itself as a weapon of white supremacy, which is, a quote from a person recently, hired by the Zoran Mamdani administration. Like, these people cannot be allowed to set the terms for what a healthy economy even means. So yeah, I mean, say it plainly, I think any reform of capitalism that actually benefits the American worker, that restores family formation, that rebuilds towns and production, can really only come from the right. The libertarian won't do it, and the leftist can't be trusted to do it. And I think this is a point I usually raise with some of my friends is the free market dogmatism on the right, historically, I would argue, has actually made the woke capital problem even worse. And I think the reason is pretty simple. It's essentially game theory. My narrative or my argument would be that corporate America learned, especially in the modern era, that neutrality doesn't function the way it used to. So even mainstream business writers have said that abstention and neutrality no longer work the way they once did, right? And you see in business class courses like the idea like the global value chain, for example, international business. But anyway, so the incentives I think becomes perverse if the GOP becomes a party of free market fanatics, meaning no matter what corporate America does, if Republicans win, businesses get tax cuts and deregulation anyways, because the party treats it like a sacred doctrine. And if that is the mindset of the GOP, and big business is looking at a polarized country and asks, if politics is unavoidable, who will they align with? Then they're always, I would argue, they're going to align with the left, right? Because if our posture, right, if the posture of the Republican Party is tax cuts and deregulation, no matter what, then let's just think about it, right? So let's say Republicans win, and corporations will likely get a pro-business policy whether they back the GOP or not. But if Democrats win and corporations visibly backed the GOP, then the downside risk is enormous, right? Like for them, like you're going to face regulatory retaliation, they're going to face investigations, they're going to face lawsuits, and they're going to face essentially reputational assaults. So if the right signals will deliver for capital regardless, then capital rationally hedges left, right? Not because CEOs are they genuinely buy into wokeism, but because they prefer a strategy that minimizes risk and maximizes leverage. And I think you kind of see this in the money. I think McKinsey, they actually came out with a consulting report, and I hate consultants, but it's quite nice that they release this information. They analyze racial equity commitments from essentially Fortune 1000, and they found that these companies essentially donated $340 billion towards racial equity initiatives between May of 2020 and October of 2022. So the corporations, they're putting their money where their mouth is, right? They're essentially subsidizing our political enemies, and I think that's a problem, right? If the right refuses to actually govern capital doesn't actually become neutral; it becomes political, and it will pick the side that can hurt it. Which means I think this free market purist approach on the right ends up underwriting the very regime they claim to hate, right? Which is concentrated corporate power paired with progressive ideological enforcement. And so I think the conclusion is clean, right? The libertarians won't govern, and the left governs with ideology and spite. And free market dogmatism creates incentives for corporate America to drift left as a defensive posture. So if conservatives have to govern deliberately, then it has to be done toward family, toward community, and national interests. And I think they have to be willing to discipline capital when capital becomes a rival power center.
Right, and you bring up a good point about the big corporations and the companies. Remember when Dobbs got overturned, or the Dobbs decision came out in the Supreme Court? They were flying immediately. You saw after all these companies were paying for flights for women to get abortions that were in red states, moving a blue state, going to a blue state for an abortion and stuff like that. So these big companies tend to go to the left, and even for immigration policy and stuff like that as well.
Well, yeah, if we're willing to take up Milton Friedman's, I think deranged idea that the only social responsibility of corporations is to make a profit, then why would they not sell away our country in order to make, that additional buck? I don't even blame them if like that is their only social responsibility.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, they have no incentive really to look out.
Well, yeah, I mean, in a free market, they really don't have an incentive. And I think that's really where public policy comes into play, right? It's conservative lawmakers engaging in statecraft, creating those incentives to where you're actually wedging the motivation to maximize profit towards an end goal that actually advances America's national interest, that actually advances, Americans' common good. And, about, I think the right's hand on the steering wheel, no incentives means, it's kind of a Mad Max situation.
Totally. Okay. And the your little conclusion, go ahead and, explain why we shouldn't have to live like this.
Sure. I mean, let's go back to the question, all right, that really framed the whole show, which is, do free markets, really work? If work means assets inflate and consumption gets optimized, then sure, you can, find some random graph or some chart and just declare victory. But if work means what conservatives, should mean, a family wage, stable communities, productive investment, and, something that at least approximates the national interest, then the neoliberal consensus has failed on, I would say, all terms. Not because markets are evil, but because we judge success by the wrong scoreboard. And I think that really takes us back to where we started, right? Which is, that AEI dynamism anecdote or that moment, telling people that staying to care for your sick mother is, a bad reason or it is an irrational attachment. I think it wasn't just a rude comment. I think it's really a confession of the rot of this worldview. Because, this worldview that treats duty as inefficiency cannot build a nation of families. It can build a nation of movers, right? It can build an economy of movers. It can build a workforce of free agents, of contractors, but it can't actually build a people who stay, who sacrifice, and pass down an inheritance to the next generation. And so it's kind of like this reflex, I would say, from, I guess, our weaker sisters on the right, that, this violates free markets. I think it's exactly what kept conservatives stuck. It treated governing as betrayal, right? It treated outcomes as irrelevant. It turns market freedom into some sacred object in some temple that you're not allowed to touch, even when the system is clearly chewing up people that, they claim to represent. And so I guess, the decision rule I want people to walk away with is, when we look at our economy, right? When we look at our economic system, can ordinary work support a family, right? Can communities keep their people? Does capital actually build or extract? And does trade actually strengthen the national interest or hollow it out? And I think that's really how you should be judging economic policy. And, I'll kind of end with a line that, I really think should anchor the conversation, which is, the invisible hand is an explanation of how capitalism can work, not a promise that it will. So, conservatives have to stop worshiping market freedom as some, creed and start practicing statecraft, right? Setting rules, building institutions, enforcing standards, that order markets toward human flourishing. Because if we refuse to govern the economy, someone else will. And they will not govern it for the family, for the town, for the nation. And I think, the final point I want to make is, to kind of take this back, we really need to reclaim government and economy, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And we need to be bold enough to rule the market instead of being ruled by it. And so this means, I think, answering to families and communities instead of, slogans and shareholders. Like, we can't allow our, policy making decisions to be dictated by, I think pretty biased institutions like Club for Growth and, AFP. Like, we Republicans and conservatives should be allowed to debate and discuss these ideas freely and come to our own conclusions. And I think if we're able to get to that point where we're able to, stop treating free markets as some ideology and as a means to an end, then I really do think, our children will look back and say that, this was the beginning of our American Restoration.
Very well said, Andre. Excellent. All right, so we'll get out of the PowerPoint and we'll go back to full screen and we'll take questions and comments from the audience.
Sounds great.
We have a comment from @Daniel Ocon at 220. Always great takes, Andre. @ZSports12, dude,
I always
you're
do.
literally so smart. I have no idea what you're saying. And then @James
Read,
Shardo, 6468, based as always, Andre. So you got some good fans behind you in the audience this evening.
Well, because I'm based, and these, free market shills for, big corporate America, they're cringe. They should, we should ratio max them. I don't know.
Have you swinging with the ratio maxing? All right.
Yeah, well, it's either that or looks maxing, right?
Yeah, it's got to be one of the two.
Yeah, gotta pick a struggle.
Yeah, pick one. That's awesome. So yeah, if anyone in the chat has any questions, please submit them to the chat @Gianna Gallo -C Ado Bofa BOFA in caps.
Ligma, I agree, Gianna.
And then @ZSports12, UK just won on a buzzer beater. Good. Congratulations to UK.
Yeah, I can't really brag about, University of South Carolina sports team. Well, I guess our women's basketball team. Although I think the last time I heard about them was like some player got arrested for kidnapping. So
Yikes.
I guess I can brag about, I don't know any other school team that has that kind of a amazing reputation.
Yep. Was she on the Delta Force with Captain Nicolas Maduro? Do you know?
Maybe. Who knows? The power of University of South Carolina will continue to astound me.
Definitely. We have a couple questions coming in @Lily M 1082. What's your favorite Yo Mama joke?
I used to know so many back in middle
It's been
school.
a while since I've had to think of one.
The problem is I actually used to memorize a lot, but then I had to delete some to make room in my memory for Chuck Norris jokes. Problem is I don't even have those anymore because I've replaced them with like useless economic trivia. And so therein lies a great tragedy of, actually reading and learning about stuff.
Totally. I think I can't really remember mine, but mine might have been Yo Mama's so fat she fell through the car or something. I don't know. It was always like overweight jokes that got me a laugh. Okay, so question from Gianna Gallo. What about purple makes purple so special, Aulden? Purple been my favorite color since I was, as long as I can remember, the color of my college and my hometown university, the University of Evansville. I was a swimmer there in college. My grandfather was the founding member of the swim team at the University of Evansville. He also was a professor there for, I believe, over 3 decades or so. And I went there, obviously. So just a lot of family. And my cousin also attended there for a while, went to the PA school. And a lot of my best friends are from there. So just purple in general. And it's always been a cozy color. Like when I'm sad, I'll wear purple a lot. So it's just always kind of kept me a little cozy and happy. And
That's a pretty good Yo Mama joke, Gianna.
Yeah, Yo Mama so fat her belt size the equator. And at James Shardle 6468, you can brag about us at YAC. It's out of South Carolina University.
Yeah, so actually, in the University of South Carolina, and this kind of goes back to I guess like very early part of our conversation was like I was starting to get disillusioned with these like standard conservative youth organizations that would be operating on campus universities. Mainly because I always got the vibe, right, or the feel that they were just kind of sad and pathetic. Not all of them, but it was just kind of like this, thing where everyone would get together like once a week, and then everyone would just kind of like complain, right? And it would be like this kind of like sob, boo-hoo, woe's me, therapy, was it like a sphere of safety for these right of center people to just complain about like, oh, libs are stupid. It's like, yeah, like we didn't need to meet for an hour to talk about libs are stupid. Like everyone already knows that. And so part of the idea I decided to create was this youth organization that really was, at my college called Young Americans for Constitutionalism, where we would actually get together and we would like actively try to learn something about, conservative political theory or American political thought. And then we would then, kind of get ourselves riled up and then proceed to actually participate in the political arena, right? So whether it come from, speech writing for, local state legislators, running in elections, whether it be, essentially just doing door knock campaigns. That was really kind of the motif and the theme of Young Americans for Constitutionalism. And seems to me, even though I've left, they've continued to operate with my successors. So that's great.
Tremendous. Yeah, Andre, I believe a real question from Daniel Aken. All right, a real question for Andre. So, if the role of the government is to foster flourishing, in what way has Trump's tariffs encouraged flourishing? How would you use them if you were in power?
Well, I think the problem is tariffs is a core idea I wholeheartedly support. I think the problem is like the Trump administration coming into, power was just a massive coalition of various disparate interest groups, right? So the problem is no one actually agreed on what the point of tariffs was. And what we saw was a completely, I would say, mostly incoherent tariff strategy, right? So you had some people whose argument was tariffs are there to raise revenue. There were those people who say, the goal of tariffs was to essentially reindustrialize America. And then you had the free traders who wormed their way into government, which annoys the frick out of me that they're Cato people currently in the Trump admin. But their idea was, we're going to use tariffs as some negotiation strategy to get more free trade, whatever that means. And the problem is, I think, because the Trump MAGA movement was such a massive coalition, I think Trump tried to do all three. And it turns out everything more or less floundered. I don't think the economy dealt with the shock too well. And so ultimately, I don't think it was actually that effective in actually cultivating human flourishing. But I would be very much open to the idea of, like a flat 10% tariff rate across the board. And maybe a specific, escalatory tariff strategy, mainly to target against China. And, paired with that would probably be some kind of industrial policy. I think, for example, like the CHIPS Act, which, I understand gets a bad rap because, Democrats are involved in it. And there are some provisions that are just kind of like lib and annoying. But, if you were to remove some of the Democrat, propaganda and some of the more lib elements of the CHIP Act, I feel like that's actually a great template for future industrial policy where I would say you pair it with tariffs to kind of protect American manufacturing and also like utilize government funds for R&D and for, internal improvements. And one of those could be, manufacturing computer chips. So I guess that would be my real answer to your real question, Dan.
All right, wonderful. We'll see if Dan has a response. And getting a phone call at AW-ZK5QB. Great stuff, Andre.
Thank you.
Yep. Amazing. Well, I'll leave it open for another minute or so, see if there's any more questions wanting to kind of start wrapping things up. We had a terrific audience tonight. Just wanting to remind, if it's your first time on the channel, please subscribe so we can continue doing more of these. Seemed like very fun, fun evening with a lot of friends and our low DC community getting together for a fun low evening and a real mature discussion about the economy and the future of the conservative movement in the United States, where the party and the movement should head. Absolutely.
Yeah, but I mean, I think ultimately the bottom line is it's time to actually address the elephant in the room. You know, free markets sounded great in the 80s. Turns out a lot of the promises didn't really materialize. And you know, I think what's the Einstein's definition of insanity? Doing the same thing
Continue
over and over
the
again.
same thing over and over and expecting different results.
Right. So, you know, I feel like there's enough insane people already with the Democrats. We don't really need to emulate their strategies. So I feel like it's, you know, time for us to reconsider course.
Tracking. And that may be the case. We'll see. We have primary elections that will be happening over the next 6 to 7 months and beyond. And then the general election this November for the all 435 House seats are due up and around a third of the Senate. So we will definitely be keeping track on that and see if there's any candidates that might be a little sympathetic to Andre's views and maybe break from the GOP mainstream on this. So,
yeah. I mean, I think there's currently signs that, to a certain degree, my ideas have gotten at least some traction in the GOP. I think Josh Hawley is probably one of the stronger senators right now on this issue. I think J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, I think are, you know, I think strong indicators that the GOP is finally willing to, I think, just confront the economic reality that we're in. So exciting stuff.
Yeah, maybe that time. Absolutely. Well, if no one else has any other questions for the evening, we'll wrap up the stream here tonight. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and thank you to Andre for such a thoughtful discussion.
Feels great to be awoken.
Mm-hmm. And we'll go ahead and sign off. And you have been awoken with Aulden. All right. Good night, everybody. Much love. Thank you very much, Andre, again.
All right.